Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Let's see. Today we have Chris Lamb. And please, welcome for the bits from the lintian-maintainers. Enjoy.
Good morning. Thanks very much, particularly for persevering through the technical difficulties, usual X-random nonsense. It usually works. Worked yesterday, worked at other times. Hey, let's go. Anyway, great to see so many people out at 10 a.m. It was a struggle for me, so thank you very much. Thanks very much. First, a big welcome and a thanks, particularly to Felix, who can't make it to DebConf. He provided some extra useful info, valuable feedback on the presentation. So I just want to upfront say thanks to him and other people like Sean, who provided input as well and ideas and things like that, and they've helped shape what's included here. So thank you to them. So today I'm going to talk about quite a few topics, sort of a whistle-stop tour of Lintian. What is Lintian? What have we been doing since last DebConf? We didn't actually give a talk at last DebConf, but we'll sort of pretend we did, and we'll pretend we'll do one from now on. What's the relationship between Debian Policy and Lintian? It's always interesting questions. And then what's perhaps on the next roadmap? What's on the roadmap for Lintian over the next year? And then how to contribute. So, patch is always welcome, as they say. So jumping in very quickly, what is Lintian? Well, what is a linter to begin with? So a lint comes from this sort of pocket lint, the sort of stuff you get in your pockets, or like, well, I've got some on here, this kind of like, it's not a problem, but let's just try and get rid of it, that kind of thing. Or if you use a tumble dryer, that thing that collects all that kind of weird thready dirt kind of thing. So that's where the name comes from. But the tool in itself doesn't check for invalid input. It finds issues in essentially valid input, if you see what I mean. So, for example, it might say, you might find various and comment on various improvements, or talk about various conventions that might make your code a little bit better, and say, hey, you probably want to do this, or it's sort of best software engineering practice to do this. It looks a bit better, it's a bit easier to read. Your code is completely valid. It follows the specification exactly, but there you might still be able to, there's still room for improvement and things like that. Linters as a separate tool are perhaps a bit of an, not outdated concept, but a concept from, say, maybe about 10 years ago. Now, it slightly makes more sense to integrate them directly into compilers, because they're already doing most of the work of mucking around with the source code anyway. So people don't necessarily use a separate linter for C projects, because GCC is quite naggy if you turn on various options and things like that. But I guess technically, all of those extra warnings that it can give you if you turn them on, they count as lint tools. I mean, your code is valid, but you might want to just do this thing instead and things like that. So yeah. So quick stats on Lintian. I mean, you just install it with apt install Lintian. It's also available in Buster backports. We try and keep that up to date as much as possible. It's also in stretch backports until that goes away. So you can always, on any Debian system, get a fairly recent version of Lintian, and that's usually what you always want to be running, and things like that. Maybe that's a bit too small, but you run Lintian on typically you run it on a changes file. So after you've built your Debian package, you end up with a .changes file, which represents your build that you've just done. And you say, Lintian, please check against this kind of package here. That's the usual way people are running it. And it'll spit out 0 to many lines of informative information about your package that it's found, problems, potential improvements. So the first thing to notice is, so it says my package, license problem, PHP license. So yes, that's referring to that you might, these are called the tags along here, bad homepage, spelling error in man page. So we have a number of tags. We have, I think, something like 4,000 different tags. No, 1,300 tags? Forgotten. I used to have it on the slides, don't know why I removed it. So these are the tags here, and then there's some extra data at the end. So for example, when we emit this tag in Lintian, we say, oh, the problem is in this file here, so you don't have to search around yourself. If Lintian already knows where it is, yeah, it's probably over here. or this one here, bad homepage. And so this is the bad homepage in question. So it's just saying this is your homepage that you've used. Again, you can find it quite easily. And here again, spelling error in man page, and it's referring to this man page, and it's saying that you've misspelt modified as modified. Okay, pretty useful. Okay. The other thing to notice here is the very first column, E, W, and I, and these refer to different severity levels. So we have an error level severity, warning level severity, and informational severity. So, I mean, there's this sort of idea of prioritization of what you might want to attack first, and things like that. And then we'll come on to those severity levels later when we talk about the lintian and Debian policy. But this is sort of the format of the output and sort of how it's sort of structured in the end. If you run it with the --info or -big I argument, you actually get quite helpful long descriptions about the problem. So, for example, if we did this for the package we just did, it would say that, oh yes, bad homepage missing, leading, blah, 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 and it would say, oh yes, it would actually give some sort of textual description. So the home page field in this package is garbage, please fix it. There's this problem here. It might give you some references, to, not this one, but they often give references to the policy in question, or perhaps to a link to the developer's reference, or a, you know, if it's a Perl thing, might link directly to the Perl policy and things like that. So you can just find out more information, sort of telling you why and perhaps how to fix the problem as well, which is very useful. So you don't have to, you know, research from like why is this a problem? What have I done wrong? You know, things like that. Particularly useful if a new tag has been introduced and your package was seemingly okay, and then it's got some new lintian warning coming up, and you're like, oh, has some sort of policy changed? Has some sort of is best practice moving in this direction? It's sort of useful to get this extra textual description of what's going on. There is the concept of overrides. So lintian, of course, is not infallible. It's got bugs in itself, but we'll come to those come to those later. But say that there is a legitimate reason for having the PHP license in there, or one of those other things that might make a bit more sense in context. But you go like, no, lintian, I know better. I know, it's fine. You can do overrides, and that basically you add a file. You can look it up in the documentation about where exactly to put these files, etc. But you can just say, no, lintian, I see what you've said, and I'm just going to sort of slightly overrule you and add an override and things like that. We also publish the reports of lintian on an automated sort of cron basis on lintian.debian.org, which I'm sure you've all seen. And everyone's got their own, every maintainer has their own page. So here's mine, and here's sort of all the listings of the various lintian warnings and errors and updates that I might want to apply to all the packages that I have maintained or uploaded. So for example, sorry if it's too small, so I'll read it out. On the CPIO package, there's a spelling error in the changelog where someone has missed a apostrophe in didn't. Cool, I'll get around to that someday. Great. There's a few lesser known features about lintian. So for example, there are experimental level checks. So if you remember, we had the error, warning, informational. There's actually another level under that called pedantic. And orthogonal to that, so an entirely separate axis that is, we have experimental checks. And they're often new ones where we're not really sure whether it'll work or there'll be too many false positives. So, and it's sort of a little bit easier just to release it and let lintian.debian.org run run itself over the entire archive and get a feel for, is this tag even useful? Is it generating essentially garbage? 10,000 packages are violating this tag. That probably isn't that useful. Let's see, we can revolve and refine from there, instead of just sort of shipping it out to everyone and things like that. So it's a good way of doing, well, like the experimental suite, the one after unstable, just a good way of sort of, we'll just put it out there, and you have to sort of explicitly opt into using the experimental ones, but they're sort of useful for the development process and things like that. Often tags that have been introduced to lintian and then have sort of shown to be problematic, or like, oh, well, it sort of made sense at first, but in reality it doesn't really, it's not useful or something, when we got down to it. And we've moved them from non-experimental to experimental and things like that. So it's not always from experimental to real and things like that. So, yeah. It's kind of useful. For one example is the systemd service file missing hardening features. That has basically checks systemd service files for whether you've added something like, has its own private temporary directory or things like that. But that requires a longish whitelist of these security hardening features. And so we added it as an experimental check because we knew we'd be missing some. And so we can look through the reports on lintian.debian.org and be like, oh, well, yeah, it's saying that this package violates this tag. It's saying this package is missing these hardening features. But actually, it does have the hardening features. So we just need to fix lintian. And then eventually, maybe, this one will turn into a production, non-experimental tag. There are ftp-master autorejects. Hopefully these are lesser known to you. So these are a very small number of lintian tags that when you upload to the Debian archive, if the DAC tool notices that your package violates these very small subset of tags, then your package will be rejected outright. So for example, I think if you try and install a file into like literal slash, the the root directory of the file system, that'll be rejected. Other things like if you try and install a package that ships an apt keyring, it also will reject it. And also some various embedded libraries get rejected as well. That last one's a good example because some of the ftp-master auto-rejects can be overridden. Some of them can't be, but some of them can. So you can still sort of get around the rejection and things like that. If there is a legitimate case. I mean, obviously don't just override because, yeah, great. The other perhaps lesser known feature around lintian in Debian is its inclusion into the ultimate Debian database. So this is a SQL Postgres database that sort of captures the world and pretends that Debian is a very nice SQL database that you can query and do fascinating things with. You can find more information about that on the Debian wiki. So for example, for lintian, there's a very large table called lintian, and that has, so for example, you can get every single package, the version, and all the tags that that package. So libchild Perl version 13-1 has been emitted by lintian.debian.org to have all of these tags here. And so you can start to do interesting queries or start to script things like that. I mean, I threw one together yesterday where I was completely failing at joins, so I did it manually. But basically it's saying that what hour are you more likely to upload a package with an empty directory? And it seems more likely that happens in the evening. Stupid example, you can probably think of better ones. I was at a loss. Patch is welcome. But you can start to do these things like, connect up with this, or, what if this package here and it's built against this, or, yeah. Possibilities are endless and things like that. So what's been happening since DebConf 18, perhaps say the past year? So I went from the end of, I think it's 7th of August. I think I used that as the cutoff date. So we've had quite a few code changes in the past year. That's slightly cheating because we did some refactoring, so that's perhaps not particularly fair. But there's been a huge amount of code changes and things like that. A lot of them happening on salsa.debian.org, which we really, really like as a collaboration tool. We'll come onto that later. It's so much easier than reviewing patches on the Debian BTS, particularly when the code is moving so fast, and it's easy actually to make these larger refactorings because code on the BTS that's under review doesn't get outdated as quickly and things like that. We've had approximately 100 new tags, new checks being added to lintian, which is pretty good. Yeah, that's the entire list of them. I glanced through this when preparing these slides and sort of came out with a few interesting ones that I just might quickly run over. So for example, you can find packaging bugs quite quickly. This was, so if you install a 0-byte file to, say, user bin, it will warn about that, because that's usually a problem. So I think there was a race condition in some build system, and it resulted in something being overridden with an empty file because there's some interesting pipe nonsense and things like that. It wasn't flushing some buffer when running, parallel equals 100 mode. I think that was the issue. And it ended up with, we were shipping a 0-byte file in user bin instead of the actual binary. And that's something that linting can easily detect and is very unlikely to have any false positives, because you probably shouldn't have 0-byte files in your user bin, things like that. Is that even a valid executable? Interesting. We also added quite a few checks for package versions. This is something that I have actually failed at a few times. So a few of my packages have I think I have one package with an epoch of 5. We don't necessarily need to go into the details of that one, but these particular checks ensure that you don't accidentally go backwards or reuse various Debian package versions. Tends to confuse the archive a little, so it's probably not a good idea. Also confuses users, but also confuses the archive. Things like that. One for reproducible builds. If your binary packages, for example, the binaries in your binary package include the build path, it means that it's unlikely that your package will be reproducible, because if you then rebuilt the package in a different directory, you would end up with a different binary, and so your build would not be reproducible, things like that. And so we added a lintian check to say, well, if your build path is X and your binary contains X, you probably won't be reproducible. You might as well know this at lintian time. So yeah, they can flag up that. So you can use it to help out things like that. So you don't have to wait for the reproducible builds things to build twice and for you to get the alert, etc., etc. Removing the sort of old crufty stuff around Debian. If you're still building DBG SYM packages manually in your control file, it will say you probably don't want to do that. We have automatic debug symbols now. Of course, you can override that. There are legitimate reasons for having those still, but that's exactly what the override system is for. So you can just say, no, it's okay. This is deliberate. We're doing this one here because X. Cool. Also trying to get rid of people using deprecated interfaces. So a few people were parsing the dpackage database directly, and that was making GM unable to do various refactorings and things like that, because it would break packages that would just sort of bypass something else. I think that was the idea. And also an interesting one where it would check in a maintainer script, so post-inst and pre-inst for version strings. And if those were extremely old, like for example, old stable, etch kind of thing, it would say, yeah, you've probably got code in your maintainer scripts that is for a really old version. You probably just want to get rid of it. Like, come on, yeah, we don't even support that. So yeah, it could do that because obviously your versions are in your Debian changelog file with dates, and we know the dates of the Debian releases. So if we see a version that is really old, just be like, yeah, you can probably get rid of that code. It's probably not very useful. Another interesting one, you can prevent against confused maintainers. So if there's a weird thing with non-free that you need to ask to do auto. When you upload to unstable, obviously your package gets built in every single architecture, just as you would expect. You don't have to do anything, it's all automated. No one really thinks about this. But for non-free, the situation is slightly different. And so a bunch of people were uploading packages to non-free and wondering why they weren't sort of appearing in the archive. And so, yeah, there's just tag for that one. So it prevents a bunch of confused maintainers being like, oh, I didn't realize my binary wasn't available 3 months on. So it's kind of good that way. And the security one, what I mentioned earlier, if your package installs an apt keyring, into apt GPG, whatever it is, that's probably not a good idea. Bypassing system security like that ain't good. So no, we're not allowing that one and things like that. The other thing in the past year, we've done a lot, well, particularly Felix, who I mentioned at the top of the talk, doing a bunch of Testsuite improvements. The Testsuite has now moved from a slightly older way of doing it in Perl to something called TAP, which is a way of doing tests in Perl. It's kind of cool. Things like that. And got a much better test coverage across all the tags. And hopefully you're going to be able to leverage that into improving the speed of the test suite, which will help development speed and things like that. Countless false positives fixed. these are the ones I dug out of the changelog in the past year. Yeah, so there's quite a few false positives in Lintian. We spend most of the time, perhaps 50% of the time, just sort of receiving bug reports saying, oh yeah, okay, we just need to add this exception, or oh, we need to accommodate this particular thing and things like that. So that's obviously quite common, things like that. So sort of perhaps on the more philosophical things, what's the relationship between Debian Policy and Lintian and things like that? So the Debian Policy basically documents the requirements that each package must satisfy to be included in the distribution. So things must be in this directory, things like that. Like some of the things, you read through it, they're pretty obvious, but some of them, but basically it's to help consistency and things like that. The policy is good. I don't need to tell you this, so yeah. But what is the relationship between them? I mean, policy says X, Lintian has Y, and things like that. I just thought I'd try and throw it together in one of those trendy Venn diagrams here. So in this circle here, we have what Debian Policy dictates. So it says, oh, your package should do X, it should not do Y, etc., etc. And then in this circle here, we have what Lintian warns about. So it says, you can't install this to here, 0-byte files in user bin, so for example. And the bit in between is obviously what the intersection between them is like, and that's sort of the bread and butter of what Lintian is about. It's saying that Lintian has detected you have this problem in your package, and that problem is actually a violation of the Debian policy. Very useful. You don't want that in the Debian archive whatsoever. But then you can also immediately see there's a whole bunch of other issues, other categories here that are not part of that intersection. So you have a whole bunch of things, for example, that Lintian warns about that aren't in policy. So, for example, these are conventions, 0-byte file in user bin. I don't think that's in policy, but it's probably not a good idea. And it probably doesn't need to be in policy because it sort of wouldn't make much sense. You'd be like, well, why would you do that? That's just kind of useless. So, yeah, moving on. Also, things that are not appropriate for policy. Policy can't dictate too much, really. It has a limit to what it can dictate. And Lintian is obviously just trying to provide sort of perhaps conventions and perhaps best practice in a larger sense. And so that will should never be in policy itself. And so Lintian will warn about that as well. There's also a bunch of essentially unimplemented features in Lintian. So basically something that Debian policy dictates that Lintian does not warn about. And so these are obviously encapsulated by this part of the circle here that doesn't intersect with that one. So that's an interesting one. And then, of course, we have just completely random ideas out in the middle of nowhere that occupy all the white space around the Venn diagram. So just completely random things that neither policy says anything about, or Lintian doesn't find. Yeah. So these are basically your wish list bugs that Lintian might want to check in the future. One example of how Lintian and Debian Policy can interact is, one good example is the package uses the vendor-specific patch series. So in Debian patches directory of a source package, you have the series file, which lists in order the patches that should be applied to your package prior to build, and then unapplied at the end, etc. Making customizations to the package itself. So the file is usually called series, just series by itself. But it also supported what was called a vendor-specific patch series, where if you suffix that with, say, for example, .ubuntu, those patches would only be applied in that vendor, in that essentially distribution, vendor being the term that dpackage uses for the wider sense of, and it's used by different distributions and things like that. So, different blends might have their own vendor and things like that. Different other Debian derivatives might be their own vendor in themselves. And they could have their own their own vendor-specific patches on top, which could live in the Debian package, but they would not be applied because Debian would only care about the ones in series. It obviously wouldn't apply the ones in a Debian-specific build from the patches listed in series.ubuntu, because it's not Ubuntu. Kind of quite useful. but that was deemed to be a violation. I think that was first brought up on a lintian bug, and it's like, well, is this something Debian wants to do or not do? There was good arguments either way, and so the lintian maintainers sort of offloaded it onto the Debian Policy, or the real saga. I'm probably sketching over the details here. All can be found on this bug. But it's like, well, we're not sure. Policy, can you make a decision here? And they did their usual thing, came up with the rationale and things like that, and said, actually, no, we don't want vendor-specific patch series. Take it up with them, not me. And then the lintian maintainers would be like, okay, cool, we'll just, lintian says that packages shouldn't do this, so lintian should warn about this. So yeah. Lintian is very interesting because whilst it is things that aren't necessarily in the policy, people still look at the output of lintian. I mean, it might be fair to say that even if you ignore its output, at least sort of everyone looks at the output of lintian, like they are aware of, perhaps, at least aware of the warnings or tags that are being emitted by lintian. So it is a sort of interesting tool where it's sort of entirely optional, but sort of isn't, like everyone is looking at it. So it's sort of very skirting this really murky ground of how much influence, if I can put it that way, it has over Debian conventions and things like that. One way of looking at it is that the idea of a de jure versus de facto, or in Greek you might have nomos and phusis. So I mean, one way of hilarious way I heard recently is if you're driving along a deserted coastal road and there's a stop sign, no one about, if you stop at the stop sign with no one about, no one's going to catch you, that's an example of phusis in Greek philosophy. But then if that road continues over a cliff, you would stop anyway, and that's an example of nomos. So like you would just not go over the cliff because, yeah, things like that. And so one way of, one sort of slightly humorous way of looking at the relationship between Debian Policy and lintian is that Debian Policy might be the de jure rules. This is laying down the law. This is what you should do. But lintian serves as a sort of de facto lowercase p policy in that if enough people see this tag, then it's likely to be people might follow it just because they sort of slightly look at it and be like, well, I must try and remove lintian warnings. They're warnings, I should try and remove them, try and get to zero. We're all geeks, we like to, get our inboxes down to zero or our lintian warnings down to zero and things like that. So yeah, so lintian has to be very careful and play an interesting, not game, but it has to tread a very fine line against, whilst it can warn about any sort of convention, it does have a little bit more lowercase p power than might be immediately apparent from just being another tool on your system. If people are following it, even perhaps not explicitly so, it does need to be careful and balance those two roles. And people use this tool very differently. So some people see lintian as an enforcer, either as a tool to enforce various changes, or they feel it's enforcing it on them. So, I mean, as I essentially implied earlier, lintian is a great way of not enforcing, or you can at least affect a large number of packages at once without actually making NMUs. Because if you, for example, you think, oh, we should get rid of, I think that Python 2 should go away, so we'll add a check about if you use Python 2, it should give you a warning. That's a good way of sort of hinting at developers to perhaps move away from that, things like that, even though that's not in policy. But this rubs up against various things because lintian is essentially telling you what to do, and that's not really that nice when you have a tool telling you, or anyone telling you exactly what to do. The other way of looking at lintian is sort of a kindly helper, just saying, hey, you might want to check this out, things like that. And depending on one's mood, like lintian can either be this enforcer or sort of kindly guide saying, oh, yeah, you might want to take a look at this kind of thing like that. In one way, it is a sort of kindly helper in that tags are sort of private. I mean, when you see them prior to upload, you see them prior to upload, so you aren't necessarily exposed to people don't see that you've made a particular warning, or, oh, I screwed up here, I can just fix that, no one will notice, excellent, things like that. Of course, tags can appear later, so that's not necessarily the case, but you are sort of free to experiment with package changes locally without being subject to, breaking up the people's systems, just to put it that way. So, yeah. And what do we do when there's no project consensus on an idea? It's very difficult for lintian to know what to do. Should it add a warning? And what level does it? What level should that warning be at? It's difficult to know, and things like that. For example, this speaks to the previous slide, severity level. So depending on whether it's an error, warning, informational, pedantic, or whether it's the separate experimental classification, that's a big bearing on how much you should sort of take care of that particular tag. And so if there isn't project consensus, it would obviously not make sense to make it an error tag, for example, and things like that. Or make it too strong, at least at first, and just see how it goes and things like that. What else? I guess certainty levels are another issue. There's, in addition to the severity level of a particular tag, there's also an idea of certainty, which tries to capture tries to capture the idea of the false positive rate of this particular tag. And we'll come on to this one in a little bit as well. So what's in the year ahead in lintian? So we obviously want to add a whole new bunch of checks and bug fixes and things like that. A bunch of optimizations. I want to speed it up a bit. It's a bit slow in various areas. Internal cleanups, of course. You always improve your code. Particularly, we want to improve the Testsuite coverage and particularly optimize the Testsuite. It's very slow right now. It probably takes sort of an hour to run on Salsa, sometimes hitting up against the timeout for the runners there, and locally on my fairly fast system, it takes 25 minutes to run the whole Testsuite, which isn't a great development cycle and things like that. Other things like maybe on the roadmap, which have perhaps been on the roadmap for many years now, I really want to do structured metadata. So if you remember at the end of each tag where it made sense, it would actually try and give you a reference to the violating line, the violating of the file in question. So for example, my package is using the dpackage database directly, which I shouldn't do, in my pre-inst on line 12. Now, what I'd really like to do is on lintian.debian.org, I'd like that to be a hyperlink that takes me direct to sources.debian.org of that file anchored to line 12. So I can immediately say, oh yeah, cool. That'd be really useful. And all the data's there. It just needs sort of internal restructuring, because this is actually just a string, unfortunately. It doesn't have any kind of metadata adjacent to that. So that'd be a really good way of moving that forward. And there's an open bug for that somewhere. Perhaps automated fixing of various lintian tags. We have a tool called lintian-brush, which is in a separate repository, and that can fix up a whole bunch of things already. For example, moving HTTP, insecure HTTP URLs to HTTPS where appropriate and things like that. So it can make a vast array of easy changes straight away, things like that. Maybe a mascot. We currently have the L, which I showed at the beginning. If you have any ideas about an interesting, cool mascot for lintian that might capture its various nuances, then I'm all ears and things like that. So how to contribute to lintian? We always need new contributors. Everything always does. People power is great. Please come and join us. The first way you can contribute to lintian, and in a very productive way, is to file bugs. So usual things, what lintian version you're using, of course. What's very important is the exact input that you're using, the exact package you're using, so we can kind of recreate it, perhaps make a Testsuite improvement around that area. Not just the latest version, because obviously if the bug lingers around, it may not be the latest anymore, things like that. And also the output that you're seeing. Obviously, sometimes the bug reports are saying, well, there's a false positive in X, but what's it actually saying? What line is it violating? We can't tell, and things like that. So kind of the obvious things like that. Do be nice. I mean, when lintian, if you do feel that lintian is nagging you incorrectly, it's just a bug. It's just code. It's not judging you. It doesn't have really have an opinion. Yeah, so if you file a bug and a false positive, it's just not, it's not saying that you suck or Lintian has a completely idea about how Debian should work and things like that. It's usually just a bug. We can just fix it. Let's just move on. No need to get like offended that your Lintian thinks your package is violating when it really isn't. This is so unfair. It's such an injustice. No, it's just a bug. We'll fix it. Moving on. We really value non-code contributions. So, for example, improving the advice and descriptions. So if you remember the bad homepage example, it had sort of a description of why having a bad homepage is a bad idea. Yeah, turns out. Improving and adding references, perhaps into Debian Policy or to other links or usual reasons for why a package might be violating a particular tag. So just to reuse an example from earlier, the empty file in user bin, then it should probably say, oh, there might be this is why this might have happened, and so you can, if you're reading the lintian output, you can very quickly go to that and say, oh, okay, oh yeah, it was probably this, and so you can just basically save a bunch of time. And so if you have had to do some extra investigation from a lintian tag, if you just throw that over the wall to the lintian maintainers on a bug report or anything like that, we'll happily include it in the descriptions. They can never be detailed enough, if you see what I mean. So they can always be improved. Oh yes, for example, there's the example of the long description for that tag. Requests for new tags or new checks are very welcome. They come in a lot and things like that. So if you have an idea about if you've come up a problem with your package that you've shipped and Lintian, you think, oh, perhaps Lintian could have warned me about that before I screwed up everyone's systems. If it could have been mechanically checked by Lintian, just file a wishlist bug. It can always just be left or not prioritized as much. But often it can spark larger ideas about, oh, we can actually, oh, I see what the problem with that particular upload was. We can probably expand that check and check more packages at once, and that'd be really good. And so you can prevent future problems that other maintainers can be prevented from making the same problem as you did, which is great. They can just move on, things like that. Please do those via the BTS, wishlist bugs as normal. It's very helpful if you can suggest a tag name and perhaps a draft long description with references if you've got them and things like that. This helps shape the, if you've got an idea about what the tag and the description should say, that certainly immediately conveys, in the same sense that a picture is worth 1,000 words, the tag name and the tag description conveys quite a lot about what you're trying to check and the scope of what you're trying to check and things like that. So you can get to the implementation a bit quicker. Bug triage, of course, very, very useful. It's a very large package with a bunch of I think oldish bugs. Some of them can be merged, some of them just don't really apply anymore. Patches could be rebased and things like that. So there's a whole bunch of triage that can be done and things like that. So people are always working on the most highest priority thing. Code contributions, of course, extremely welcome. The bit of an honest truth here, the Lintian code is what we might call mature. It's been that way. The Testsuite is slow, as I mentioned already, work in progress. Working on that. Hopefully you get something soon, so the development cycle is a bit less painful. The code is Perl. Yeah, it's not. I didn't want to be coding Perl in 2019. Well, I didn't think I'd be coding Perl in 2019 and into 2020. So, but yeah, it's fairly good Perl. It's getting better. There's multiple Perls in there, as usual, things like that. But yeah, it's fairly readable. Yeah. Contribution workflow is fairly sort of, I'm going to say, up to date. BTS entry if you want it first, if you want to, and then basically jump as quickly as possible to a salsa merge request because code speaks very quickly. And then you also get, it's very easy to review on the GitLab. You can know, can you improve this small thing? And we've ended up with basically nicer code because you can ask for smaller refinements that would be a bit too much of a hassle to ask for as a back and forth on the BTS. But when you can just do line by line comments on Salsa, then that's just a lot easier. and it runs the test suite, etc. And please provide tests, because that's great. Regressions happen, and having test coverage is also good. Your developers, I don't need to tell you this. Great. So, I mean, I want to thank you all for being here. Again, I want to thank Felix and also all the other Lintian maintainers. I'm the one standing here. But there's been so many contributors throughout the years. Paul Wise has been great at filing bugs. Well, I'm just blanking on names now, but Lintian is an old project, and it's had a lot of input, and there's a lot of people monitoring and providing very useful advice on bug reports and things like that. So thank you to all of them, and thank you for being here this morning. And yeah, you can contact us, blah, 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 usual channels, and things like that. So very welcome to entertain questions now. So yeah, I just want to thank you for being here this morning. Thank you.
Any questions, please? Use your microphone.
Hi. You described Lintian in some slides as being the enforcer, then sometimes the helper. I'd like to add a small tale here to this. I once had to upload a new package to Ubuntu. I got reviews from fellow developers. They told me some things to address. Run Lintian, of course. I fixed all those issues. Then I uploaded it, and an archive admin ran it with Pedantic and came back to me with a huge list of things to fix, which I did, or I added overrides. That's fine. My point here is that Lintian taught me a lot about packaging. There was stuff I had no idea that existed there. And I think nowadays it's perhaps the easiest way to learn about policy changes, to learn about what else we should be doing, because you just run it and it tells you. So it's great, awesome.
Great. Oh, thank you. I mean, yes, and I find myself often, I mean, I sort of know the code and the checks that Lintian does, but I often find myself reading through some of the long descriptions thinking, oh, I didn't actually know that. That's kind of interesting. I mean, the auto build and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. It tells you what's possibly wrong and also how to fix it, which is, I mean, come on, it's excellent.
Yeah. Great, thank you, thank you.
Okay, there is no more time. So let's say thank you again to Chris Lamb.
Thank you.